My family kicked me out of the house on my birthday. I worked for years to turn my life around, and when I did, they returned to try and steal everything from me. I was newly 18 and hadn't even finished high school when my parents and my golden child brother kicked me out. I wasn't too mad, though couch surfing was better than living with them. They didn't even show up for my high school graduation. Life was extremely difficult for a while. Being homeless makes it hard to find and keep a job, and without a job, finding a place to live is nearly impossible. My parents never reached out to me. There were times I was tempted to beg them for forgiveness, but thankfully I held out. Years later, I secured a retail job and worked hard to rent a condo. Life improved for a few years, and although I couldn't save much, at least I had my own place. I rented with someone, but it was better than being homeless. However, life crumbled again during the start of the 2020 pandemic. I lost my job and couldn't renew the lease on my condo because my roommate also lost his job, and neither of us could afford the place on unemployment money. My roommate left early to move back in with relatives, and I had to sell nearly all of my stuff to avoid becoming homeless again. Fortunately, I had a plan. Years ago, I bought a truck because I love trucks. I found a $1,000 camper in good shape and put it on my truck so I could live out of it temporarily. It ended up being longer than I expected. I hoped to live out of the camper at my parents' house, where my brother and his family still lived. I swallowed my pride and asked if I could stay in the camper beside their house, but they said they had a full house and didn't want me there. They agreed to let me park my camper if I paid what it cost to rent an apartment in my area. That was too much just to park my camper. I was jobless and trying to save as much of my unemployment money as I could. My parents called my camper an eyesore and told me to take a hike. My sister-in-law thought it was hilarious that I had to live in a camper, and my brother joined her in mocking me, calling me a homeless bum. After being told no by my parents, I parked my truck camper in a store parking lot to sleep. The first night, I was scared out of my mind that someone might break in, so I didn't sleep well. Finding a stable place to park was difficult. I looked for a job similar to my old one, and it took months of living the nomadic camper life. During that time, I dealt with everything from beggars and addicts to people demanding I leave because my camper was an eyesore. At one point, someone who claimed to be with an AOU threatened me. I moved my camper to avoid trouble. To have a steady supply of electricity, I learned to use a long extension cord to plug in anywhere I could to recharge my camper batteries. This meant sneaking around and plugging it into an outside outlet of a random building. I know that's a crummy thing to do, but I had to keep my batteries charged so my refrigerator would stay cold. I had a small solar power bank for recharging my phone, but I didn't have a generator, and generators are noisy and require fuel. So I did what I had to do. After months of living like that, I finally got a new job. I had to move to the neighboring city to find a job that didn't involve retail. I worked retail in college and promised myself never again, though I was nearly ready to break that promise. I was still getting unemployment money but had no stable place to live while receiving it, and I didn't want to be jobless when it ran out. Plus, I was bored out of my mind. I had little to do but read, watch movies on a small portable DVD player, use my phone or laptop, and keep note of where I could park and which local public bathrooms I could use. I envy the Japanese public bathhouses. We could really use those here. When I finally landed a new job, I practically lived in the back lot of the building by the warehouse in old employee parking spaces. No one else seemed to use them because they were so far in the back that the area was borderline forgotten. My boss, the company owner, liked this arrangement because I was always available to take any shift as long as I had enough sleep. He even let me take the camper off my truck and set it up in one of the spaces so I could drive around without it. I'm not sure if this was legal, but no one bothered us. I didn't have to deal with many trespassers, there were a few, but the security guards escorted them out. I was on call almost all the time when they needed me and was working nearly every day of the week. My boss let me plug my camper into the building for power and water, and I paid a small amount of rent by working for free on Sundays. I had to shower at a friend's apartment or my local gym, as the camper only had a portable toilet, and I didn't want to fill it because emptying it is a nasty chore. I used other bathrooms as often as I could. I had a key to the warehouse and could use the bathroom there at any hour. I was even on a first-name basis with the night security guard, who has since become one of my closest friends. The camper was easy to heat in the winter with a small electric heater. Summers were not fun, though the camper didn't have AC, so I got a USB portable air conditioner to make it bearable. I made a lot of overtime pay and learned new skills from other employees. Midway through the year, I landed a better position in the company as a supervisor and started making a better salary than at my old job. I decided I wanted a house. Losing my condo made me realize I needed something more stable for the long term. I found a 3-bedroom manufactured home on a small property just 2 miles from work. I managed to get it for $10,000 less than the asking price. I used nearly my entire savings for a down payment and got approved for a home loan. I finally didn't have to live in a camper anymore. There was enough space for me to park my truck behind the house and set up the camper in the backyard. I put it there as its own little building in case I wanted to use it again. When I was settled in the house, I bragged about it on social media. My family saw the post, and that's when things really started. A few weeks later, my parents and brother, along with his family, came to visit unannounced to have a tour of my home. I hadn't given them my address, so I still don't know how they found out where I live. None of my friends have confessed, and no prior family members visited me before that, so I wonder if they stalked me at work and followed me home. Once I opened the door, they practically shoved their way in like rambunctious tourists and made themselves at home. They kept poking around, and my sister-in-law had a creepy smirk. It was only later that I figured out why they visited. My parents constantly talked about how I had so much extra space now, and my brother kept remarking about how there was more space than at our parents' house. Eventually, my brother asked to speak privately. Everyone else left the room and piled onto the front porch. That's when I realized they had planned something. My brother Dan said the house was too much for me alone and that he should move in with his family because his wife was pregnant with their 4th child and my house was closer to his job. He pointed out that I already had the camper, so I could just live in that outside while they lived in the main house. He never once mentioned offering rent. Dan has a good job. He talked about changes and curfews and that I couldn't just walk in without prior notice. I picked up my phone and started recording. Dan didn't seem to care or notice and kept talking about why he needed my house, acting like it was a done deal. He tried to shake my hand, but I finally showed my backbone and said no. Dan stumbled backward for a second. I'd rarely ever raised my voice to him because our parents punished me whenever I did, but this was my house. I told him my house was not up for grabs and that acting like I'll let him move in won't make it happen. I bought my house for me. It's not my fault he keeps having more kids and has to live with our parents because he can't afford to move out. Dan got close to me and said I didn't deserve the house. I laughed and said I worked hard to buy my house, so I deserved it. Dan started yelling that I have no wife or kids and don't need all the space, so I may as well give it to him. I said I'm not giving him anything and he never offered to pay rent. I'd still be covering the entire mortgage on my own house without being able to live in it. Dan told me he shouldn't have to pay rent because his family comes first and our parents said I was going to do this. I yelled that their word wasn't law and told Dan they didn't have the power to give my house to him. Then my parents and sister-in-law barged back in and surrounded me to try to force me to agree. There was a lot of fighting, but to sum it up, I heard "just do it" for Dan more times than I can remember. I told them they don't have a say in my life or my house and to get out before I called the cops. Sister-in-law screamed that she was pregnant and I can't do this to her. I said I did nothing to her. She just assumed she could take from me. I had no obligation to her or her family. Then I called her a stuck-up woman who never respected me, so I don't care what she thinks or how many kids she has. She won't be living in my house. She attacked me, but my brother held her back. I said I'd call the police if they didn't leave. My parents told Dan they were leaving, and my mother said I had a week to come to my senses. I told her I won't be and to not come back. I told sister-in-law that my phone recorded everything and if she tried anything, I'd press charges. She screamed and stormed out. My mother was the last one out and said I better do this for Dan and sister-in-law. I told her I won't be. After kicking them out, I posted the story on social media. It spread quickly, but I deleted it and made my profile private. I posted because I knew they'd twist the event to make me the villain. I had video evidence to back up my story, so I got many family members on my side. My parents, Dan, and sister-in-law had a few supporters, but not much. Many knew how entitled they were, so they understood. One person called me, ranting that I was a horrible brother, but I ended the call and blocked the number. A week later, my parents showed up with Dan at my front porch. They rang the doorbell and pounded on the door until I answered. They tried to shove their way in, but I'd installed latch chains and braced my body against the door. My father and brother demanded I let them in, but I said I was recording everything and would call the police if they tried to force their way in again. My mother sweetly asked if I was ready to let my brother move in. I told them to leave. My mother cried and asked why I can't just do this for Dan because he's my beloved brother. I laughed and said I don't love him because he treated me like crap, and they encouraged him. They are terrible parents, and he is a terrible brother. They left surprisingly easily. I thought the mess was over, but they had other plans. I came home later that week to find a moving truck and Dan's minivan in my driveway. They were moving in. I was furious and told them to stop, but sister-in-law smugly said they were moving in because Mummy allowed it. I locked myself in my truck and called the cops. Sister-in-law threatened to key my truck if I didn't stop, but the 911 operator heard it. When the police arrived, Dan and sister-in-law had locked themselves in my house. I showed the police my driver's license with my address, and they saw they'd changed the lock and drilled out the old one. Dan called our parents, who arrived while I talked to the cops. My parents lied, saying I'd agreed to rent my house to Dan. Dan and sister-in-law came out with fake rental papers, but my signature wasn't on it. They badly forged my signature. I said it was blatant fraud, and the cops would figure it out. Dan got scared, but my mother doubled down, saying I should do this for Dan and live in the camper. I told her to give Dan her house instead. The cops separated us, and I said I wanted them out, or I'd press charges. Sister-in-law screamed and threw a tantrum. I said I recorded everything and would press charges for assault. They finally left. I went online and shared what happened. Most of the family sided with me. My parents were too embarrassed to defend their actions. My brother and sister-in-law still live with my parents. I offered to host Christmas Eve in my new house and didn't invite my parents. Sister-in-law kept making passive-aggressive posts about not having enough space. I think it's driving my parents crazy. Maybe they could move into a camper in their backyard and let Dan take over their house completely. They could do that for Dan,